Oh, God, that was awesome. Nice one, too. Chunk. He's got it good. That's a good one. Boy, I hope that was on camera. That was right on the edge. He came right off that tree. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. I got a really good question from a viewer the other day that wanted to know if I would fish topwater baits any other time than when it's calm out. And I thought that was an interesting question because I do think the consensus out there by a lot of anglers is you can only fish a topwater bait when it's calm. I'm here to tell you that's not the case, but there are very specific instances and certain baits that work better than others. So we're going to dive into this question a little bit more. Before I do get into that though, I do want to remind you that I've got a members only channel. So if you're looking for a little bit more content from me, extra videos, monthly live streams, direct access to me, things like that, click the join button on my YouTube homepage and you'll find out more through that process. Also, if you want to support the channel in another way and you're looking to purchase tackle, please use my Tackle Warehouse affiliate link, which is in the video description. The little bit that I make from that goes right back into making content for everyone in YouTube world. All right, so the question had to do with, do I only use topwater baits when the water, the surface, is flat, calm? And the answer to that is no, I don't. In fact, there are a lot of times when I would rather have some chop to the water. Now there's a couple of things that you need to take into account. First, you need to look at the topwater bait that you want to use. Not all topwater baits can function in rougher water. Now when I say rougher water, I'm talking you can potentially fish a topwater bait in water that's got 2-foot chop, like really good chop. Now usually I don't want those to be cresting waves. I'd rather them be big rolling waves like you find sometimes on the Great Lakes. But the reality is, if the bait is functioning properly, you can use it in really rough water. But there are things that need to come into play with that too. So let's just talk about the baits. If you've got, as a rule of thumb, if you've got a moving bait that has just a consistent speed to it, those are generally the ones that will work better in rougher water. So your plopper style baits, your walking style baits like a spook, things like that, where you're walking them just with a consistent pace, your buzz baits, those baits all generally are a straight moving bait that, yes, you can stop and go, but generally speaking, they've got a consistent speed. That's important in rough water because it gives the fish something to continuously track. If you want to throw, say, a popper or a twitch style bait, something like a prop style bait, maybe it's a like a jitterbug, you know, those are baits that generally are very slow moving baits. Either you just kind of give it a quick pop and let it sit, let the rings disperse, as they say with things like a popper, and a jitterbug is a real slow moving bait as well. So even though that's a consistently moving bait, that's very, very dependent on getting the correct water flow into the cup of the bait. So that bait would blow out in rough water. So a jitterbug is a bait that's a slow moving bait that really depends on being able to come through the water correctly to get the bait to move properly. If you're in a rough chop, that's not going to function. So as a rule of thumb, you're generally talking about your slow moving baits, and your twitching style baits are not nearly as good as your consistently faster moving baits. Another thing that I think is really important is to recognize the water clarity. So when you're talking about your rougher water conditions, almost all of the time, if I'm going to be throwing a topwater in that type of wave action, it's going to be clear water. And by clear, I'm talking at least probably 2 feet of visibility. The fish need to be able to track it through the waves, which is really important. So I'll generally continue to throw a topwater as the water gets rougher in clearer water. So if you're fishing a place where you've got 10 feet of visibility, at that point, you know, a place like Lake Champlain, you'd be amazed at how aggressive the smallmouth can be in tracking baits that are in 2-foot chop. I mean, they're literally going up waves and coming down waves, and you have smallmouth jumping from one wave into another wave. Like, they can find those baits really well, but they're able to track it because that bait's consistently moving. It's not unusual, you know, if you think about a fish's lifestyle, especially on bigger lakes that have a lot of wave action, those fish are used to tracking that their forage species in rough water. And a lot of times, well, not a lot of times, but one of the best ways bass like to capture forage is to pin them against the surface. So whether that means there's flat, calm conditions or rough water, it doesn't really matter, because the fish are still going to push their bait to the surface. And I think a lot of times, potentially in rougher water, they're just as aggressive. A lot of times the anglers just don't see it because you don't hear the splash, you don't hear the fish schooling like you would when the conditions are calm. And to go the other way, I actually think you can have conditions that are too calm. I don't really like to fish topwaters when you have flat, calm conditions where you don't even have a ripple on the water. Topwaters are almost too good for the fish to see at that time. It's not that I won't throw them. I would just prefer to have a ripple at least on the surface, something to break up the way that fish sees it, something to kind of hide those treble hooks that are hanging off the bottom of the bait. So I will still throw them in calm conditions, flat, calm conditions, but I would rather have some sort of water movement on the surface. I think that that's really important. The other thing just to continue to think about as well is, you know, where you're fishing it. If you've got rougher conditions, so you've got a good strong wind blowing into a really shallow flat, you say 2 foot of water, I might be more, I would rather fish a topwater in really shallow water with less rough conditions. If I've got pretty heavy wave action blowing into an area, I generally don't like to fish real shallow water. So I might move out to that 4 foot of water range, just some place where the fish aren't really getting rolled around as much as you would think in some of the wave action. And if I am fishing that really shallow water, I would generally prefer to throw a subsurface bait at that point, just because I feel like the fish aren't as willing to be up in those waves. You know, if you've got 2.5 foot of water and you've got a 6-inch to a 1 foot chop rolling in, that top of the water is just fluctuating so much the fish are almost pinned to the bottom in that case. So, you know, the water depth matters, the water clarity matters, the type of topwater matters, but don't think just because you've got not flat, calm conditions that you can't throw a topwater. I would say in a lot of circumstances, you're actually better off throwing a topwater when you've got some chop that's on the surface. But again, it goes down to the type of bait you're fishing, the type of cover you're fishing. You know, if you want to be fishing tight to lay down trees and you have good, strong wind blowing into those trees, they generally pull out of the trees when it's like that because they just would get thrown around. So you got to recognize, you know, is the wave action too much too much where it prevents the fish from being in the area that you want them to be? If that's the case, topwater is not going to be your choice. But if it's the wave action isn't changing the fish's habitat or where they're at or their feeding style, then you can throw topwater all day long. You know, that's the type of thing where if you're fishing that really clear water and you're in 10 foot of water chasing smallmouth on Lake Champlain, you could have 4 foot wind and those fish aren't going to get pushed out of that area. It's just important to recognize what is the wave action doing. If it's actually throttling that area, that's going to be bad for a topwater. But ultimately, don't let a chop on the lake turn you off from throwing topwater. In fact, sometimes it can actually make the bite better. So hopefully I answered the question for the viewer. If you've got follow-up questions, throw it in the comment section. Otherwise, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Stay tuned. We'll have a new video coming out tomorrow.